So, hi everyone. I hope you're all doing okay. So, next week, medyo crazy yung week natin, no? So, this video will just be all about trying to use some strategies to be able to make next week a little bit easier. So, I'm going to be discussing how we can approach the quiz 3 in embryology, which is about the development of the respiratory system and the heart. Yung respiratory system naman is quite simple, but the heart is quite complicated. Pero I think ang mga tinatanong lang naman is primarily centered about the primordia and the derivative. So tingnan natin yung mga important things about that. And then a very complicated topic that you should never underestimate in heart as a pump in physiology is the cardiac and vascular function curves. So these can be very complicated. So we'll try to be able to explain this in the most simple way possible. And lastly, some important points for the cluster exam 1 in biochemistry, which covers the digestion ng tatlong macromolecules and the introduction to metabolism. So we'll start with embryology. And, studying embryology is, I think, nung high school tayo, we've encountered the phrase that the universe is a space-time continuum, di ba? Space-time continuum. So we move in 3 dimensions in space, and then we're always marching forward in time. So time always goes forward. So the universe is a space-time continuum. And I'd like to think of anatomy and embryology in the same way. Diba? In anatomy, in gross anatomy, we're studying the spatial relationships ng mga structures sa katawan natin. Ano yung anterior ng arteries, veins, ano yung nasa likod, may mga nerves ba dyan, anong viscera, anong muscle. And when we're studying embryology, we're studying about time, the development of the embryo, the fetus, until it becomes the mature human being. Diba? So we're studying the forward movement of the embryo through time, okay, in embryology. So space-time continuum of the universe, and we also have a space-time continuum in anatomy and embryology. So it's very abstract kasi, di ba? And it's very hard to visualize things. That's why it's very important to watch animations or have some good illustrations sa embryology. And I think Langman naman has good illustrations sa YouTube. Mayroong mga good animations naman so that we can visualize and concretize what is happening, di ba? But yung mga tinatanong naman, usually, ito yung nakapansin kong hierarchy of yield ng mga tinatanong nila. Siguro 60 to 70% na tinatanong nila is all about the primordia and the derivative. Primordia meaning ano yung pinanggalingan. For example, ano yung pinanggalingan ng right ventricle? Ano yung pinanggalingan ng left ventricle? Diba? Sinus venosus ba? Ganyan. And yung derivative. So kung sinus venosus, ano yung naging derivative niya sa adult? Okay, so that's the right atrium, for example. And then abnormality. So what would happen kapag may abnormality sa gantong portion of the developmental process? Hindi nag-close yung ganitong opening, ano mangyayari? Nag-transpose yung mga arteries, what will happen? And lastly, yung mga 1 to 2 questions lang is anong week of development nangyayari and anong process nangyayari sa week na yon? Okay, nagka-cardiac looping ba? Okay, so nagkakaroon ba ng tracheoesophageal septum? So these things. So we'll primarily focus dito sa primordia and derivative. And in the development of the respiratory system, so inulit lang natin yung na-discuss natin sa head and neck. Kasi meron ding part sa respiratory system, of course, the nose, the nasal cavity, diba? Part yan naman ng upper respiratory system. And then the larynx, diba? Na-discuss na rin natin yan in the pharyngeal arches. And ang medyo bago lang dito is the development of the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. So yung first two, na-discuss na natin in the head and neck embryology. So, quick review na lang to. So, we know that we have 5 prominences. We have the frontonasal prominence, frontal bone kasi ito, di ba? Frontonasal. So, hanggang dito. So, frontonasal prominence. So, which gives rise to the lateral nasal prominence sa gilid, lateral. And then medial nasal prominence sa gitna. And then maxillary prominence, very easy. Maxilla is the maxillary bone here, di ba? Forming the cheek and the lateral portion of the upper lip kasi ito yung maxilla. So, upper lip siya. And then the mandible. So, of course, the lower lip. So, summarize naman siya sa table na to. Ayan, frontonasal, forehead, the bridge of the nose. Siya yung nag-give rise sa medial and lateral nasal prominences. So, yung frontonasal, di ba? Ito yan. Yan. So, maxillary, as I said, ito. Cheeks, the lateral portion of the upper lip. Medial nasal, kasi ito yung medial nasal, gitna ng nose. So, philtrum, itong groove dyan sa gitna. Yan, groove dito. That's the philtrum. Yan, tip of the nose, yan. From the medial nasal, sa gitna. And the lateral nasal, syempre lateral, nasa gilid, that's the ala. And of course, mandibular, which is this one, forming the lower lip. Okay? Now, how are we able to form yung ating palate na ngayon? So, we have what we call yung ating intermaxillary segment. So, yung primordial ng ating primary palate. Siyempre, from the name itself, intermaxillary, it's formed from your maxillary prominences. Okay, sa gilid. And, so pag nag-fuse yung maxillary prominences mo, so maxilla, di ba dito? And then the medial nasal prominence, so sa gitna. So, you will form your intermaxillary segment. Okay? So, hindi nagka-participate yung lateral nasal. Ala lang siya. Pero yung medial nasal, tapos nagsama sila nung maxillary sa kabila, tapos maxillary sa kabila, then of course, you will form this segment right here, the intermaxillary segment, which will become the primary palate right here. Okay? So, kasama dyan yung philtrum, itong ang groove dito, yung 4 incisors, sa harap. Okay? 4 incisors sa harap. And that's what we call your primary palate. So, triangular siya in shape. So, ano abnormality mangyayari kapag hindi nag-fuse yan? Yung maxillary and yung medial nasal prominence, then you will have, kapag hindi nag-fuse to, you will have your cleft lip. Okay? Paano naman yung palate? Sa loob. Diba? Yung second, yung palate na, yung iniisip nating hard palate natin, which is in the embryo, it's called your secondary palate. So, this one. Yan, the secondary palate. So, how is it formed? So, it's also formed from your maxillary prominences. They will form what we call your palatine shelf. So, a palatine shelf which will continue to fuse, and fuse, forming your secondary palate. So, galing lang siyang maxillary prominence. So, pag nag-fuse yan, you will have your hard palate, your secondary palate right here. And kapag hindi yan nag-fuse, what will happen? We will have a cleft palate. So, yan yung abnormalities natin here in the development of the nose, nasal cavity, and the oral cavity. Now, when it comes to the larynx, so na-discuss natin to sa pharyngeal arches natin. So, we know that our larynx, okay, which is housed by the thyroid and cricoid cartilage, is formed by your fourth and sixth, di ba? That's your fourth and sixth pharyngeal arches. So, I think that's it. Siguro lang, is important lang siguro yung germ layer. The internal lining naman, no? Okay, the internal lining no, ng larynx is from the endoderm. Okay? Kasi lahat naman ng internal lining natin, endoderm, internal lining GI tract, internal lining ng respiratory tract, all endoderm yan lahat. Now, in the development of the trachea, bronchi, and the lungs, so back up muna tayo. So, review natin. Di ba? We have 3 germ layers. So, drawing nga natin. So, di ba? We have your ectoderm, and then we have your, anong after ng ectoderm, pinakalabas, di ba? Ecto nga, sa labas. And then we have your mesoderm, which is divided into 2, di ba? So, this is your mesoderm. So, inotochord natin sa gitna, di ba? So, your mesoderm, which is divided into 2, you have your somatic lateral plate mesoderm and your splanchnic lateral plate mesoderm. Yan yung 2 divisions ng lateral plate. Kasi di ba meron tayong paraxial, intermediate, and then yung lateral plate divided into somatic and the splanchnic. And then the innermost part ng ating embryo is your endoderm. Okay? So, imagine nyo, itong 3 layers na yan, nag-fold pa ganun. Naging circle sila. Di ba, flat lang yan? So, mag-fold kasi yan, and then it will form a tube. So, pag nag-form ka ng tube, what will happen is, the internal, so ito, yung pag naging tube na tong endoderm, edi yan yung pinakaloob. Pag naging tube na yung mesoderm, edi siya na yung sunod. And then, pag naging tube na yung ectoderm, edi yan yung pinakalabas. So, sabi ko nga, di ba, the internal lining of your GI tract and your respiratory is formed by your endoderm. So, ito yan, no? Ito. So, initially kasi connected daw yung ating GI, so yung foregut natin, and yung respiratory diverticulum. So, yung respiratory diverticulum, very important. That's the primordia of your trachea, bronchi, and lungs. So, ang internal lining yan is from the endoderm. Okay? Same thing with your GI. So, endoderm yan lahat. Ito mga to. Endoderm. Okay? Endoderm. So nakita na natin yung primordia ng esophagus, GI tract, and yung primordia ng ating respiratory tree, which is the respiratory diverticulum. So of course, hindi naman pwedeng magkadikit yan. So kailangan natin yan i-separate. So we will have what we call tracheoesophageal folds. Trachea, esophageal, esophagus, fold. So kailangan natin sila lagyan ng hati. Okay? Siyempre, we don't want it to be continuous with them to be continuous with each other. And then, eventually, we will be able to form a tracheoesophageal septum. So, septum, tagahati. So, ayan na. Separated na yung ating trachea and esophagus. Ayan na. Full separation na. So, yung trachea, may sarili siyang endoderm. Yung esophagus, mayroon na siyang sariling endoderm as well. Okay? So yung trachea, it will form yung ating lung buds. Ayan. So, and then it will form your alveoli. So, forming your lungs. So, there. And this is very important to understand itong tracheoesophageal septum and itong because and yung spatial relationship niya with the esophagus kasi possible na kapag hindi properly nag-form yung tracheoesophageal septum, walang hati, we will have what we call a fistula. So this one. A fistula is an abnormal connection. So kapag meron kang fistula, pwedeng magkaroon ng abnormal connection between your esophagus and your trachea. So pwedeng may abnormal connection yung upper part ng esophagus and the trachea, pwedeng yung lower part, okay, pwedeng both parts magkaroon ng abnormal connection. So these are fistulas. Ano naman yung tinatawag nating atresia? Atresia, ibig sabihin may hati. So may disconnection. So take a look at this, atretic segment. Kasi dapat yung esophagus, diretso lang yan pababa, di ba? Kaso nga, nagkaroon siya ng abnormal fistula or connection with the trachea. So, nahati siya. Merong ano dito, may segment dito na putol. So, that's what we call your atresia. So, esophageal atresia. So, usually, magkasama yan. Ang esophageal fistula is usually accompanied by your esophageal atresia. And I think ang most common natin dito is this one. I think 90% is this one. Meron tayong blind pouch ng upper esophagus and yung lower esophagus yung nagkakaroon ng fistula with the trachea. So blind pouch meaning yan, no? Putol siya eh. Hindi na makakatuloy yung pagkain kung kumain man yung embryo. Wala, putol yung esophagus eh. Kasi yung lower part connected to the trachea. So I think this is the most common. So blind pouch yung upper esophagus and then ang may fistula is yung lower esophagus. Okay? And so yun na, nakabuo na tayo ng trachea, bronchi, and then yung formation ng ating alveoli. So we have 4 periods here. So pseudoglandular, canalicular, terminal sac, and alveolar. I don't know how high of a yield this is. Pero ang keywords lang naman natin dito is, yung pinakauna, syempre, wala ka munang respiratory bronchioles. And then, sa canalicular, you will now have your respiratory bronchioles. Okay? And then, pagdating sa terminal sac, then you will now, kaya nga sac, you now form your alveoli or your primitive alveoli kasi sac yung alveoli, di ba? And then it is in this point na nagkakaroon na rin ng capillaries, di ba? Yung capillaries natin are important for gas exchange. So dito wala pa, di ba? Pero dito capillaries now establish close contact, so magkalapit na. So kung ito yung mga alveolar sacs natin, so may mga capillaries na dyan for gas exchange. Okay? And then syempre yung last is the alveolar period. You now have mature alveoli. And then syempre yung din nila, yung capillaries din nila is also mature. So yan lang yan. Dito wala pang respiratory bronchiole. So ano pa lang, terminal bronchioles pa lang. Dito respiratory bronchioles na. So respiratory bronchioles, first ones which are capable of gas exchange. Pero only in the terminal sac period will you be forming those sacs, yung alveoli and yung capillary having close contact. And at the alveolar period, dun lang sila nagmamature. So yan na, parang grapes na, di ba, sa alveolar period. Okay, so that's it for the development of the respiratory system. How about for the development of the heart? So as I said, diba, 60 to 70% of questions are from the primordia and the derivatives. So nag-start kasi yung heart as a tube like this. By the way, nanggaling siya sa visceral or the splanchnic lateral plate mesoderm. So kung babalikan natin, nanggaling siya dito, the splanchnic lateral plate mesoderm. Okay, and then it forms your primary heart field and your secondary heart fields. Your primary heart field forms both of your atria and your left ventricle only. Okay? So, kung ito yung heart. So, this one, and this one, both atria and the left ventricle is formed from the primary heart field. Meanwhile, your secondary heart field forms your right ventricle, your conus cordis, and your truncus arteriosus. So, ano ba yung mga terms na yan? So, balikan natin yung figure. So, on the most inferior part, dyan nanggagaling yung venous blood. And on the most superior part, dyan yung outflow o yung arterial blood. So, ang pinakaunang portion natin dito, this is your sinus venosus. Sorry, mali yung binilugan ko. Erase natin. So, ito, sinus venosus. Ibahin natin yung ink, this one. This is your sinus venosus. And it forms, sabi dyan, the smooth wall of your right atrium. So, yan daw yung magiging smooth wall ng right atrium. And madali itong tandaan kasi diba if you remember yung sinoatrial node natin, sinoatrial, diba? It's in your right atrium. Okay, so sinus venosus, sinoatrial, smooth wall of right atrium. And then your primordial atrium, which is this one. So, di ba sa atrium, yun yung nagko-collect ng blood from the venous circulation. Sila yung magiging left and right auricles or the trabeculated part of your right and left atria. Okay, again, your primordial atrium, kasi sila na yung nagko-collect ng blood, which is this one, this portion right here, sila yung nagiging trabeculated part of the left and right atrium or your left and right auricles. Now, how about your primordial ventricle? So, ito na yun. So, di ba, from the atria, papunta siya ng ventricle. So, paakyat kasi yung blood natin sa tube na to eh. So, sa papunta na siya ng ventricle, ano yung na-form niyang derivative? So, your primordial ventricle forms your left ventricle. Okay? So, kanina, yung primordial atrium, both left and right. Pero here, yung primordial ventricle natin, it only forms your left ventricle. Because the one that forms your right ventricle is your bulbus cordis. This one, itong green here, that's your bulbus cordis, that's your right ventricle. And your conus cordis, di ba? Cone, ano may cone? Di ba? Parang siyang outflow tract. Di ba? So, conus cordis, that's the outflow tract of both ventricles. So, lalabas yung blood from the right and left ventricle, pupunta sila sa isang cone-shaped part. That's your conus cordis. And lastly, it will go to the arterial circulation via the truncus arteriosus. Ayan, truncus, di ba? And arteriosus, arteria. So, that's the aortic and pulmonary trunk. So, later on, yung truncus arteriosus na yan, mahahati yan by your aorticopulmonary septum to form your aorta and your pulmonary trunk. Aorta going to the systemic circulation, pulmonary trunk going to the lungs. Ang kulang na lang natin ditong future structure or derivative is the left atrium na smooth wall. Kasi meron na tayong trabeculated, di ba? Galing siyang primordial atrium. Yung smooth wall ng ating left atrium is formed by your pulmonary veins. Okay? So, di ba yung pulmonary veins, those are the veins that drain the blood, oxygenated blood from the lungs to the left atrium. So, sila yung mag-form din ng smooth wall niya, ng left atrium. So, what will happen to this tube right here is mag-undergo siya ng what we call cardiac looping, in which pupunta na yung mga chambers into their correct positions. So what will happen is, itong mga superior portions na yan, will go ventrally in front and to the right. And itong mga inferior portions right here will go dorsally, okay, to the left, okay, and up. So again, the ones here, itong mga outflow tracts here superiorly, okay, will go, so kasama tong ventricle, sige, ulitin natin. So, itong mga superior portions right here, they will now go to their correct positions by going ventrally to the right and caudally. Meanwhile, itong mga nasa inferior portion, maglo-loop siya dorsally to the left and posterior and cranially, so paakyat. So, yan yung mangyayari. Tingnan nyo, paganyan and paganyan, and eventually you will now have this structure right here, which is quite correct na yung orientation. You have your right ventricle here, left ventricle here, right atrium here, and left atrium here. Okay? Now, so now we were able to form your chambers. How about your septa? So your aorticopulmonary septum, which divides your aortic arch from your pulmonary trunk, is formed from your neural crest cells, which form these ridges, the truncal ridge and the bulbar ridge. Now, yung formation ng septum na to is quite unique kasi hindi lang siya isang straight na septum which divides the two. What will happen is, para siyang magkakaroon ng spiral looping. So, hindi pala pwede. Basta, magkakaroon siya ng spiral looping. Imagine niyo yung straight na papel, in-spiral yung ganyan. So, it will form something like this. Okay? And what will happen is, yung outflow tract ng pulmonary trunk will be anterior. Okay? And it will swerve to the left. Meanwhile, yung outflow tract ng aorta will be posterior and to the right. Okay? So, hindi lang siyang straight na division. It's a spiral division which allows your pulmonary trunk outflow tract to be to the anteriorly and to the left. And yung outflow tract na aorta ay posterior sa likod and to the right. So, yan na yung naging final result nun. So, yan. Pag ganyan yung outflow tract niya because of the spiral septa of the aortic pulmonary septum. How about yung atrial septum? So, ito, dinivide natin yung truncus arteriosus into your aortic arch and your pulmonary trunk. Para naman i-separate natin yung dalawang atria natin. So, yung right atrium, left atrium, para natin nahatiin. So, first, what forms is what we call your septum primum, septum hati, primum primary. So, primary septum, okay? And then it will close, okay? And before it closes, magkakaroon muna tayo na tinatawag na foramen primum. Foramen, just an opening, di ba? Or ostium. O, pwede rin siyang tawaging ostium primum. And then, pag nag-close na yan, okay, meron din mag-form na pangalawang opening called your foramen secundum. So, secondary foramen, okay? So, both your foramen primum and foramen secundum are openings on your septum primum. Okay? How about, so ito na, so foramen secundum, may opening na dito. And nawala na yung foramen primum natin, nag-close na siya. Now, so hindi pa nag-close yung foramen secundum, may mag-form na bagong septum. So kung kanina septum primum, syempre, it's the primary septum, dapat kung may mag-form na isa pang septum ulit, that's what you call your septum secundum or secondary septum. Okay, and mag-fuse yan, pero mag-iiwan siya ng maliit na space or yung opening right here. So tingnan nyo yung septum primum, nag-form siya ng foramen primum which closed, and yung foramen secundum which stayed open. Your septum secundum, which is the second septum na nag-form, may opening din siya. Yung opening na yan, nung septum secundum, together with the foramen secundum, so para ka nagkaroon ng dalawang opening or naging tunnel na sila, forms what we call your foramen ovale. Again, yung opening na naiwan sa septum secundum and yung foramen secundum forms a tunnel opening called your foramen ovale. And that allows blood to flow directly from the right atrium to the left atrium. Okay? And this is very important kasi later may makikita natin na kapag napanganak na yung baby, what will happen is mag-close dapat to, itong foramen ovale forming your fossa ovalis. Kapag na-close yan, ang tawag ay fossa ovalis. So para wala nang connection ng right atrium and left atrium. Okay, kasi ngayon may butas pa blood from the right atrium kasi will go to the left atrium. So pag napanganak na yung baby, that should have closed, magiging fossa ovalis. Pero pag hindi nangyari at pag hindi nag-close yung foramen ovale, we will have an atrial septal defect. Okay? How about yung atrioventricular septum? So, kanina, pinaghiwalay natin yung dalawang atria. So, paano naman separate yung atria tsaka sa ventricle? So, ito yung sinasabi na endocardial cushions. So, endocardial cushions. Bakit endocardial? Kasi, di ba, yung ito, endoderm, yung internal lining nitong heart. Okay? So, endocardial cushions. So, mag-form yan. Ito, mag-form yan ng outpouchings and eventually they will close. Okay? To form this separation between your atria and ventricles. Okay? That's your endocardial cushions forming your atrioventricular septum. And for the interventricular septum, so kanina sineparate natin yung atria from the ventricles. Ito naman, separate natin yung dalawang ventricles. So that's your interventricular septum. And you form that from the muscular, kasi di ba muscular yung dalawang ventricles natin. So gagawa sila ng mga new cells that will divide the left and the right ventricle. You call that your muscular interventricular septum. And you also have what we call your membranous interventricular septum. So mas manipis. Yan yung mas manipis. So kung ito yung right ventricle and your left ventricle, so itong makapal here na galing sa muscular wall of the ventricles, that's your muscular interventricular septum. And yung small portion here, which did not come from the muscles of the ventricles, that's your membranous interventricular septum. Okay? So some abnormalities. So ito yung normal, situs solitus. To the left yung heart. And normal naman yung position ng organs. Kapag meron tayong situs inversus, meaning inverted yung organs. Kung mapapansin niyo yung liver nasa left side. Okay? And then yung sigmoid colon. nasa right side. So baliktad, di ba? Dapat the liver is in the right side and the sigmoid colon is on the left side. Di ba? So, pumaliktad yung orientation ng organs. And, tinawag siyang situs inversus totalis kasi even the heart ay baliktad. Dextrocardia. Dextro meaning to the right. So, to the right yung orientation ng heart. Eh, di ba normal is to the left. Kapag levocardia, levo, L for left. So, normal naman yung position ng heart. To the left naman yung ano niya, structure. Pero yung organs, baliktad pa rin. Situs inversus pa rin siya with levocardia. What about kapag yung outflow tract ay nagbaliktad? So, hindi properly nag-form yung spiral aorticopulmonary septum. So, we will have transposition of the great vessels. Your right ventricle, ang outflow tract niya will be to the aorta, and your left ventricle, ang outflow tract niya would be to the pulmonary tract. Baliktad. Tetralogy of Fallot. So, tetralogy meaning apat yung manifestations. Mnemonic niyan is PROV. Okay? Pulmonary stenosis. So, tinapapansin nyo, yung pulmonary outflow tract ay bara. May barado. R for right ventricular hypertrophy. Kasi nga barado doon, kailangan yun ng more force to be able to expel the blood. So, kumapal yung right ventricular hypertrophy. O for overriding aorta, meaning yung aorta nag-override both sa right and left ventricle. Meaning, naka-position siya overhead sa right and left ventricle. So, pwede tuloy lumabas yung blood from the right ventricle diretso sa aorta and yung left ventricle also diretso sa aorta. Okay? And V is ventricular septal defect. So, di ba sabi natin kanina that interventricular septum forms between the two ventricles. So, kapag hindi nag-properly form yung muscular and the membranous interventricular septum, then you will have an opening here, the defect, the ventricular septal defect. You also have coarctation. When you say coarctation, nag-narrow. So, that will cause increased pressures here to be able to direct blood to the systemic circulation. So, coarctation, sumikip yung aorta. Ventricular septal defect, ayan nga, hindi nag-form properly yung ventricular septum. Atrial septal defect, hindi nag-close yung foramen ovale. So, dapat maging fossa ovalis siya, pero hindi nag-close, di ba? So, ano nga ulit yung foramen ovale? Ano nag-form nun? That's your opening ng septum secundum and your foramen or ostium secundum. Okay? So, kailangan mag-close yun. Otherwise, you will have an atrial septal defect. So, patent yung kanyang foramen ovale. And patent ductus arteriosus, so recall natin, di ba? So, sa fetal circulation, mataas kasi yung resistance sa lungs. Hindi pa humihinga yung baby, so hindi pa pupunta yung blood papuntang lungs. So, what happens is yung blood from the right ventricle, meron siyang pathway to the aorta called your ductus arteriosus. Okay, so yung right ventricle, pupunta siya ng ductus arteriosus and into the aorta. Pero once the baby takes the first breath, so makaka-flow na yung blood from the right ventricle into the lungs and dapat mag-close na yung ductus arteriosus. Hindi na dapat mag-flow yung blood from the right ventricle to the aorta. Pero and what will happen is, pag nag-close na yung ductus arteriosus, it will become a ligamentum arteriosum. So ligament na lang siya. Closed na. Pag hindi nangyari yon, you will have a patent ductus arteriosus. So meron pa rin abnormal connection yung pulmonary artery to the aorta. So dadaan pa rin yung blood going to the systemic circulation. That's PDA or patent ductus arteriosus. Okay, some questions from the embryology quiz last year. So, which of the following forms the philtrum of the upper lip? So, yung philtrum of the upper lip, that's this one. Ano nga yung nagpo-form yan? That's your medial nasal prominence. So, this one. Okay? The primary palate is derived from which structure? So, yung primary palate, di ba, is formed from your intermaxillary segment. So, di ba, patriangle yun. So, parang ganyan siya, di ba? So, this is your secondary palate. This is your primary palate. Patriangle siya. And it's formed from the fusion of your medial nasal prominence and your maxillary prominence forming your intermaxillary segment. Which structure temporarily separates the nasal pits from the oral cavity? So, that would be your oronasal membrane, oral cavity, nasal cavity. So, yan, nag-separate. Temporarily lang naman. Nag-disintegrate kasi yan. That's your oronasal membrane. Which condition results from incomplete fusion of the maxillary prominence with the medial nasal prominence? So, ano nga yung fina-formula? That's the primary palate. So, ito sa harap. And that will cause your cleft lip. Okay? Kapag naman cleft palate, that's your palatine shelves failing to fuse. For the larynx, the musculature of the larynx is derived from which of the following pharyngeal arches? Again, this is fourth, and sixth pharyngeal arch. What is the germ layer origin of the epithelium of the internal lining of the trachea? So sabi natin, internal lining is always from the endoderm. Dorsal portion of the foregut becomes which structure? So dapat sabi natin kanina, mayroon dalawang structure sa harap and sa likod. This is anterior, this is posterior, di ba? This is the trachea, this is the esophagus. So dorsally or posteriorly, we will have your esophagus. Your trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs are anterior. Okay? Esophageal atresia results from abnormalities in partitioning of the esophagus and trachea by which structure? Ano nga yung nag-separate sa kanilang dalawa? That's your tracheo-esophageal septum. Your respiratory diverticulum is the primordia of your respiratory tract. A tracheoesophageal fistula having the upper segment of the esophagus ending in a blind pouch may have which of the following intrauterine manifestations? So imagine nyo, blind pouch yung upper ng esophagus, tapos yung lower part ng esophagus ay may fistula with the trachea. So imagine nyo, yung amniotic fluid na ini-swallow ng baby, maiipon dito. So hindi tutuloy sa esophagus si amniotic fluid, then you will have an overloading of amniotic fluid and you call that polyhydramnios. Many hydramnios amniotic. That's what will happen kung mayroon kang tracheoesophageal fistula or esophageal atresia. Blind pouch kasi ito eh. So iipon lang dyan, dadamay yung amniotic fluid mo. Oligohydramnios is low amniotic fluid. Okay? Polyhydramnios is marami kang amniotic fluid. What is the consequence of insufficient amounts of surfactant? So ano bang purpose ng surfactant? To decrease the surface tension. Otherwise, kung wala kang surfactant, then the surface tension will cause your alveoli to collapse. Okay? So that will be decreased alveolar surface tension. Next. Which of the following venous structures get incorporated into the left atrium? So the left atrium, sabi natin, is formed by your pulmonary veins. So letter D. Derivative of the bulbus cordis. Ano nga ang bulbus cordis? That forms your right ventricle. Ano yung nag-form ng left ventricle? That's your primitive ventricle. Your left and right atrium are formed by your primitive atrium. The smooth wall of the right atrium is a derivative of your sinus venosus. Kasi nga, dyan yung sinoatrial node, di ba? Sinus venosus. Teratogenic insults during the development of the primary heart field will result in abnormalities of, so primary heart field forms both of your atria and your left ventricle. So left ventricle. These ones, conus cordis, truncus arteriosus, and right ventricle are from your secondary heart field. So which of the following cardiac anomalies is a congenital condition where the aorta receives blood from the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk drains blood from the left ventricle? So baliktad, no? Para nag-transpose. So yung right ventricle napunta sa aorta, yung left ventricle napunta sa pulmonary trunk. So that's your transposition of the great vessels. Tetralogy is the PROV, pulmonary stenosis, right ventricular hypertrophy, overriding aorta, and ventricular septal defect. Coarctation of the aorta is when nagkaroon ng narrowing of your aorta. The development of the heart coincides with the time that laterality is established in the embryo through the presence of this embryologic structure, which also causes the induction in the neurulation. So that's your notochord. The structure induces differentiation of cells in the primary heart field into cardiac myoblasts and blood islands. That's your pharyngeal endoderm. So by the way, kung ito yung ectoderm, ito yung mesoderm mo, ito yung endoderm mo. So di ba yung heart, sabi natin, galing siya ng splanchnic lateral plate mesoderm. Ang nag-i-induce sa pag-form ng ating cardiac myoblasts, which are the precursors of the heart, and yung blood islands, which are the precursors of the blood vessels, is yung endoderm right here, the pharyngeal endoderm. So siya yung nag-i-induce nun. So sabihin niya, oy, gawa ka na ng heart. So parang siya yung signal. Okay? Which of the following statements characterize cardiac looping? So yung cardiac looping natin, di ba? Sabi natin, the cranial portion goes anteriorly into the right and yung inferior portion goes posteriorly into the left. So check natin. The caudal portion of the heart tube shifts dorsocranially into the left. So tama. Kasi di ba, ganyan siya. Ito will go here and ito will go here. So caudal portion goes palikod and to the left. So tama. Cranial portion shifts in the ventrocaudal position and to the left kasi, mali. It should be to the right. Okay? So at the end of looping, ventricular walls remain smooth. Hindi, kasi meron ka ng mga trabeculated portions. Looping out occurs outside the pericardial cavity. How can you do it outside your pericardial cavity? So it's inside your pericardial cavity pa rin. So letter A ang sagot. Okay? These are tissue masses that divide the lumen in the primitive heart, resulting in the formation of the cardiac chambers. So ano nga yun? That's your endocardial cushion. So sila yung mag-form ng cells na mag-meet to form your septa. Okay? So forming your chambers. Okay? So we now move on to physiology, pero I will not be discussing everything na kasi I think you have a good grasp naman na of the concept. Some tricky concepts lang in heart as a pump one. This one, yung important timings, this is part of the FIGREV, pero very important din to understand kung ano ba yung valves na unang nagko-close, ano ba yung mas matagal ang duration ng isovolumetric contraction and these things. So we start with ano yung unang nagko-contract. And syempre, ang unang nagko-contract in regards to the atria is your right heart. Yan, nauna siya kaysa sa left heart. And the reason for that is, tasan ba yung sinoatrial node, yung pacemaker natin? It's in the right atrium. So siya yung unang madedepolarize, siya yung unang magko-contract. Pero, bakit when it comes to ventricular contraction, is the left heart na mauuna? Kasi di ba yung mean electrical vector natin is inferior, leftward, and posterior. And mas makapal siya, so mas maraming nerve fibers, so mas maraming pupunta sa kanya, mas mauuna siyang mag-contract. Ayan, mas mauuna siyang mag-contract kaysa sa right heart. So again, the right atrium contracts first before the left atrium, but the left ventricle contracts first before the right ventricle. Okay? Now, when it comes to the closure and opening of the valves, maunang mag-close yung mitral kesa tricuspid. Bakit maunang mag-close yung mitral? Kasi maunang mag-contract yung left ventricle. Diba? Next, bakit maunang mag-open yung pulmonary valve kesa aortic valve? It's because konti lang naman yung pressure sa pulmonary circulation. In comparison to your systemic circulation, mataas yung mean arterial pressure doon, di ba? So mas kailangan yan ng more force to be able to open the aortic valve. Di ba? Pero yung pulmonary, konti lang yung resistance doon, you can easily open the pulmonary valve. Okay, so mauna mag-open. So again, mauna mag-close ang mitral sa tricuspid because the left ventricle contracts first. Mauna mag-open ang pulmonary valve kasi konti lang yung kailangan niyang i-overcome na resistance. Next, maunang mag-close ang aortic valve, okay, kaysa sa pulmonic valve. And the reason for that is kasi nga mataas yung pressure sa aorta, sa blood vessels mo in the systemic circulation, mas malakas yung backflow ng blood. Tama? So mas mataas yung backflow ng blood, mas mabilis mag-close yung ating aortic valve. Sa pulmonary circuit, sa pulmonary circulation, hindi naman ganun kataas yung pressure, so hindi ganun kalakas yung backflow. So, and marami kang blood na pinapump, di ba, from the right ventricle to the lungs. So, mas kailangan mo rin ng more time before mag-close yung pulmonary valve. Di ba? So, mas malilate siya. And that causes your physiologic splitting of the second heart sound. Di ba? Kasi mauna mag-close yung aortic valve kaysa pulmonary valve. Next, maunang mag-open ang tricuspid valve kesa mitral valve. Bakit? Kasi di ba kung ito yung heart, this is the tricuspid valve and this is the mitral valve, maunang mag-open yung tricuspid kasi ano bang mas mataas na pressure? Left ventricle or right ventricle? Di ba left ventricle? So, kailangan mag-exert ng more pressure ng blood sa atria papuntang left ventricle para mag-open. Meanwhile, yung right ventricle mo, konti lang naman muscle mass niya, hindi ganun kataas yung pressure, mas madaling makaka-flow yung blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Therefore, your tricuspid valve will open first. Okay? So, in summary, atria, right? So, right atrium will contract first before your left atrium. Your left ventricle will contract first before your right ventricle. Your mitral valve will close first before your tricuspid valve. So C means closure. So mitral closure occurs first before tricuspid closure. Pulmonary opening occurs first before your aortic opening. Your aortic closure occurs first before your pulmonary closure. Your tricuspid opens first before your mitral opening. So how about yung duration ng isovolumetric contraction and relaxation? Ano ba yung portion ng isovolumetric contraction natin dito? Pag nag-close na yung mitral valve and until mag-open yung aortic valve. Kasi pag closed yung both valves, di ba? There's isovolumetric, walang lumalabas na blood. The volume of blood in the ventricle remains the same. So yung mitral valve and the aortic valve remain closed. This is this portion right here, that is isovolumetric contraction. And mas matagal siya sa left heart. How about isovolumetric relaxation? Once na-close na yung aortic valve, hanggang sa mag-open yung mitral valve, walang pumapasok o lumalabas na blood, pero nagre-relax na yung ventricles. This is your isovolumetric relaxation. And in comparison to your right heart, ano mas malaki yung size? Your left heart. So for isovolumetric, both contraction and relaxation, ang left heart mo is always longer than your right heart. So paano naman yung ejection and filling? Baligtad lang sila. So for ejection and filling, okay, your right heart will take longer than your left heart. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So now we move on to heart as a pump 2, and this is one of the more complicated topics, and a lot of students are confused here, including me noon. And the reason for that is there are so many variables and hindi ganun ka-clear-cut kung ano yung independent variable and dependent variable mo. Why? Kasi all of them affect everybody else. So, pag change mo to, magbabago to, tas yung pagbabago ginawa mo dito, magbabago din sa original variable mo. So, everything is affecting everything, and it's because the entire circulation is a circuit. Diba? This is your systemic circulation, tas capillaries, and then venous circulation, and then back to the heart. Isang buong circuit yan eh. So, kung may baguhin ka dito, magbabago rin yan dito. Kung baguhin mo yung strength ng heart, magbabago rin yung effects mo sa cardiac output, venous return. Diba? So, yan. So we should not underestimate this topic, pero we'll try to make this as simple as possible. So by the end of this discussion, I hope you'll be able to understand itong table na ito. So let's start first with defining cardiac function and vascular function. So cardiac function, so ano yung nangyayari sa heart? So contractility niya, so gumagana na ba ng maayos yung heart? Vascular function, it's all about venous return. Kung effectively bang nababalik ng veins yung blood papuntang right atrium, right ventricle. Diba? That's venous return. So we start first with our cardiac function curve. So titignan natin kung ano yung nagiging function, kung paano gumagana yung heart natin. Based on, so on our x-axis, we have our right atrial pressure. And by the way, itong right atrial pressure natin, kasi kung mapapansin nyo, kung ito yung heart, ito yung right atrium, di ba? And it's supplied by blood from the superior vena cava and from the inferior vena cava. And so kung ano yung pressure, and wala namang valve yan, di ba? Walang valve between the superior and inferior vena cava and the right atrium. So pupunta lang yung blood dyan. So kung ano yung pressure dito, it's also the pressure here in your veins. Okay? You call the pressure here in your right atrium as right atrial pressure, and yung pressure here in your veins as the central venous pressure. So about the same lang yan. May mga 1 to 2 mmHg difference lang. Okay? Now, itong right atrial pressure natin, that is also a marker of your preload. Why? Kasi, ano ba yung, so kapag mataas yung right atrial pressure mo, ito yung right atrium, di ba? Kung mataas yung pressure mo dito, ibig sabihin maraming blood dyan. Kung maraming blood dyan, edi marami kang preload. Tama? Preload is the amount of blood in your ventricles before contraction. Di ba? So kung mataas yung pressure mo sa right atrium, edi marami ka ring blood doon sa ventricles mo to be pumped. Okay? So, yun. So, right atrial pressure in your x-axis and you have your cardiac output on the y-axis. So, what will be the predicted relationship of your right atrial pressure and cardiac output? Sabi natin, kung mataas ang right atrial pressure mo, you have more blood going into the heart. And according kay Frank Starling mechanism, di ba? The more preload you have, the more blood is in your ventricles, the more stronger your force of contraction would be. And then you will have a higher stroke volume. And the higher stroke volume will lead to a higher cardiac output. Nagplato lang siya kasi syempre, meron din namang maximum force ang pwedeng ilabas ng heart. But primarily, if you have a high right atrial pressure, then you will have more preload. Frank Starling mechanism, we will have more strength, force of contraction to pump. You have more stroke volume, therefore you will have more cardiac output. How can we change the parameters of this kapag nag-increase tayo ng contractility? Nagbigay ka ng digoxin, sympathetic stimulation. Okay? In-increase mo yung ECF calcium. What will happen is the slope will increase. Okay. So for a given right atrial pressure, nag-increase yung ating cardiac output. Hindi ba naman binago yung preload mo? Okay? Pero dahil in-increase mo yung contractility mo, lumakas yung force of contraction ng heart, you also increased your cardiac output. And kapag decreased contractility, that would be a decrease in the slope of your cardiac function curve. So for a given right atrial pressure, hindi naman nagbago yung right atrial pressure mo, but your cardiac output is now lower. Ayan, lower na siya yung cardiac output mo kasi pinahina mo na yung force of contraction ng heart mo. This is siguro parasympathetic stimulation, low ECF calcium, or high ECF sodium. Diba? Or ischemia, myocardial infarction. So yan yung nagde-decrease ng contractility. Next, we now move on to vascular function curve. The vascular function curve, same pa rin yung ano natin, same pa rin yung x-axis natin, right atrial pressure, pressure in the right atria. But the y-axis now would be your venous return, VR venous return. Amount of blood going back to the right atrium. Sa tingin nyo, ano yung magiging relationship if we increase the right atrial pressure and venous return? So imagine nyo, kung ito yung heart, ito yung veins ko, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, ito yung right atrium ko. Kung mataas yung pressure dito, sobrang daming blood dyan, sa tingin nyo ba makakabalik pa rin yung blood going to the right atrium? Marami ng blood dyan. Parang siksikan na sila. Wala nang sobrang taas ng pressure, sobrang dami mong blood, hindi na rin makakabalik yung blood mo going to your right atrium. Hindi makakapunta yung blood from your veins back to the heart. Kasi sobrang taas ng pressure mo dito, which will cause congestion. So, hindi na rin makakabalik. You will have a decrease in venous return. So, the higher your right atrial pressure, the more congested your right atrium is, the less your venous return would be. Okay, kaya pababa yung kanyang, so inverse relationship, kaya pababa yung kanyang graph. How can we change this? How can we manipulate the parameters? What if we increased yung intravascular volume? Nag-transfuse ka ng blood, for example. So kung nag-transfuse ka ng blood, okay, what will happen is your vascular function curve will shift up and to the right. So up and to the right. Why? Kasi syempre, yung right atrial pressure mo tataas din kasi you will have more blood kasi nag-transfuse ka nga ng blood. Pero tataas din yung venous return mo. Let's say, constant yung right atrial pressure. Hindi naman nagbago right atrial pressure. But your venous return will increase kasi you just have more blood in the circulation. Kapag naman baliktad, so you decrease your, so this is increase intravascular volume. Okay. What if we decrease the intravascular volume? So that will cause a shift down and to the left. So for a given right atrial pressure, your venous return would be less. Same thing. You have less blood in the circulation. Syempre, less din yung magiging blood na babalik sa heart. Ayos ba yun? So this is your vascular function curve. Now we'll try to combine both the cardiac and your vascular function curve in one graph para makita natin how things are interrelated with each other. So here, you still have your right atrial pressure in your x-axis. Pero now, our y-axis is either our cardiac output or our venous return. Okay. Sabi natin, yung venous return is inversely proportional to the right atrial pressure and your cardiac output is directly proportional. Ganyan. Diba? So, and this is possible na lagyan natin both these two variables in the y-axis. It's because same lang ang units nila. Ang units nila is both liters per minute. Cardiac output, how much blood pinapump ng heart in liters per minute. Venous return, how much liters of blood is being returned, diba, to the right atrium. So, what is this intersection point right here? Yung intersection point na yan is what we call our equilibrium point. Our equilibrium point is the right atrial pressure at which our cardiac output is equal to our vascular return. Ulit, yung equilibrium point, nag-intersect sila eh. So, equilibrium point yan equal, dapat, yung cardiac output mo and vascular and your venous return. And kung isipin natin, di ba? It makes sense. Kasi kung ano yung nilabas na blood ng heart, pupunta rin naman yun ng capillaries, ng veins, tas babalik din naman yun dapat ng heart. So kung ano man yung volume of blood na pinump ng heart po, cardiac output, dapat yun din yung amount of blood na babalik sa heart in your venous return. Okay? So that's your so at a particular right atrial pressure, yung at the point at which they intersect, that's when your cardiac output and venous return is equal. And yan yung gusto nating mangyari. But what happens, okay, what happens kapag, for example, palitan natin yung variable. You increase contractility. If you increase contractility, which of the following curves will change? Cardiac function or vascular function? Wala ka naman binago sa veins mo, so your vascular function curve will not change. But you increase the contractility, you change something in your heart, in your cardiac function curve. So sabi natin, if you increase your contractility, the slope of your cardiac function curve will increase. So that will be right here. Tingnan niya, so nag-increase. So, look at what happened to our equilibrium point. Our equilibrium point, okay, is now here. What happened? Kung in-increase mo yung contractility mo, therefore, at a particular right atrial pressure, nag-increase din yung cardiac output mo. Which also means, nag-increase din yung ating vascular return. Okay? Equal, at this point, equal pa rin, okay, yung ating cardiac output and vascular return. But, tumaas na yung value nila. Kung kanina, for example, at this point, 5 liters per minute lang. Nung in-increase na natin yung contractility, lumakas yung pumping action ng heart, tumaas yung cardiac output mo, that same blood na pinump mo na tumaas should also return back to the heart. So, dapat mag-i-increase din yung venous return mo. So, itong equilibrium point nila would probably become, for example, 6 liters per minute na. Okay? So, the values of your cardiac output and your vascular return at your equilibrium point increased. Yung value ng cardiac output and venous return, kasi nga, more blood pumped out, more blood back in. But tingnan niyo kung ano nangyari sa right atrial pressure ng equilibrium point nila. We move to the left, meaning bumaba. So, bakit bumaba? Yung equilibrium point ng right atrial pressure natin when we increase the cardiac contractility. The reason for that is, imagine nyo kung ito yung heart, tapos tinaasan natin yung contractility ng heart. Therefore, you will have lower amounts of blood remaining in the heart. So, ang tinatawag natin dyan is end-systolic volume, di ba? You increase contractility, your end-systolic volume decreases. And so, you also have less blood in your heart, less blood also in your right atrium kasi hinihigop niya yan di ba? Which also means your right atrial pressure would decrease. Ito na yung sinasabi ko sa inyo ngayon na all of these variables are interconnected. Kanina sabi natin right atrial pressure increases cardiac output. Pero nung in-increase na natin yung cardiac output, nag-decrease na ngayon yung right atrial pressure, leading to a lower equilibrium point. Okay? And it's because the more you strengthen the contraction of your heart, the less blood would remain in the heart, the less blood will be in the right atrium, therefore your right atrial pressure will fall. Okay? Okay, next. Paano naman kung i-increase natin yung intravascular volume natin? So, delete muna natin. So, what would happen if we increase the intravascular volume? Ano nga mag-change dito? Cardiac or vascular function curve? So, mag-change dito is your vascular function curve. Shift up into the right. So, what would happen is, ito. So, wala tayong babaguhin sa cardiac function curve. So, ito pa rin yung gagamitin natin. So, what happened sa ating equilibrium point? So, again, ang nangyari sa cardiac output natin and sa venous return natin ay nag-increase din before. Kasi dinagdagan mo yung intravascular volume, more venous return back to the heart, edi more din yung kanyang cardiac output. And also, what happened to the right atrial pressure? Your right atrial pressure ay nag-increase. And again, the reason for that is you increase the blood in the circulation, you increase the blood in your veins, you increase the blood also in your right atrium, causing a higher right atrial pressure. Okay? Sige. So, delete po natin lahat and let's redraw. So again, our x-axis is your right atrial pressure. On the y-axis, this is your cardiac output or venous return. And this is your original cardiac output. This is your original venous return. What would happen if change natin yung total peripheral resistance? Let's say nag-vasoconstriction tayo. Kung nag-vasoconstriction tayo, we increase the total peripheral resistance, what would happen to our cardiac and vascular function curves? Okay, ganito mangyayari. Your cardiac function curve, okay, will have a decrease in slope. Bakit? Because if you increase your total peripheral resistance due to vasoconstriction, anong variable mag-i-increase? Your afterload. You will have to fight a much higher pressure sa systemic circulation in order to pump the blood. And so your cardiac output would decrease. Diba? Kasi diba, afterload is inversely proportional to your cardiac output. Diba? So magdi-decrease din yung slope ng ating cardiac function curve. How about for your venous return curve or your vascular function curve? What will happen? So, imagine nyo, kapag nag-vasoconstrict yung arteries, nag-increase yung total peripheral resistance, konti lang din na blood yung pupunta sa venous circulation. Kasi di ba, pinaliit mo yung size ng arteries mo, may vasoconstriction, edi konti lang din yung blood na makakadaloy papuntang veins. Kung konti lang din yung blood na makakadaloy papuntang veins, then you would have low amount of volume in your veins. You will have low venous return. So it will also shift downward. Okay? So, tingnan niyo mabuti kung ano nangyari sa equilibrium natin. Yung equilibrium natin now had a lower cardiac output and lower venous return. Kasi nga, konti yung blood na napapump mo, yung cardiac output, kasi because of afterload, konti lang din yung bumabalik na blood. Okay? Konti lang din yung bumabalik na blood kasi hindi rin nakakadalo yung blood from the artery to the vein because of the vasoconstriction. But look at what happens sa ating right atrial pressure ng equilibrium point. Tingnan nyo. Ito yung original equilibrium point natin. Ito yung final equilibrium point after tayo nag-vasoconstriction. Nagbago ba? No. We did not have any change in our right atrial pressure. Bakit laging ganun? So take a look muna at what happens nung in-increase natin yung cardiac output. Sorry, di ba vasoconstriction, so more afterload, so nag-decrease yung ating cardiac output. So nung dinecrease natin yung cardiac output, ano nangyari sa blood remaining? Okay? Ano nangyari sa blood remaining in the heart? So less cardiac output, hindi natin napapump lahat ng blood palabas, naiiwan yung blood sa heart. Kung naiiwan yung blood sa heart, that would also mean that there's more blood in the right atrium. So that would initially increase your right atrial pressure. Di ba? Pero sabi natin, dahil sa pag-vasoconstrict natin ng artery, hindi nakakadalo yung dugo papuntang vein, hindi na nakakabalik yung blood na yon papuntang right atrium. So, because of the decrease in venous return, you also have a decrease in right atrial pressure. So, tingnan nyo because of vasoconstriction, we decreased the cardiac output because of increased afterload, and we decreased the venous return because of the constriction of your vessels. Yung decrease in cardiac output led to an increase in right atrial pressure, but the decrease in venous return caused a decrease in right atrial pressure. Nag-equilibrate lang sila. Walang nangyari. Therefore, your equilibrium point remains the same. Same pa rin yung right atrial pressure mo. Pero, yung values ng cardiac output and venous return mo, bumaba. Okay? So, I hope that's clear. So, let's take a look at some practice items. This is from 2026. Blood transfusion. So, nag-transfuse ka ng blood, you increase your intravascular volume. Will you shift your vascular or cardiac curve? Definitely your vascular curve. Cardiac glycosides increase the contractility of the heart. Therefore, that would be a shift in your cardiac curve. How about your venodilation? Variation relationship, venodilation, and right atrial pressure. Venodilation means you dilate your veins. What would happen to the pressure in your right atrium and into the central venous pressure? So imagine nyo, kung ito yung vein mo, tapos vinasodilate mo, ano nangyari sa pressure mo nung nilakihan mo yung vein mo? Eh di ba bumaba? Kasi malaki na yung space na pwede niyang lagyan. Di ba? So nung dinilate mo yung vein, hindi yung pressure mo dito is not as much na kasi malaki na yung pwede niyang lagyan eh. Di ba? So your venodilation would cause a decrease in central venous pressure or right atrial pressure. So this is B. Okay, this is A, this is B. How about venoconstriction? Change in cardiac curve or change in vascular curve? So baliktad naman. So venoconstriction, yung veins natin pinaliit natin. What would happen kapag kinontract natin yung veins natin? If you contract your veins, it would pump more blood. Diba? Imagine nyo to, yung vein. Pinaliit mo siya, edi more blood will be pumped back to your heart, back to your right atrium. So that would cause an increase in your venous return. Therefore, you will have a change in your vascular curve. Okay? How about vasoconstriction? So vasoconstriction causes increased TPR. And we saw that vasoconstriction changes both your vascular curve and your cardiac curve. So this is C. Vascular curve, kasi konti na lang yung blood ang punta sa vein. Kasi nga, kinstrict mo yung arteries mo. Change in the cardiac curve because of increased afterload. So bumaba yung cardiac output niya kasi ang laki ng kailangan niyang i-overcome na pressure. Okay? Next, right atrial pressure, quantitative comparison, preload 50, 70. So sabi natin, di ba, with a higher right atrial pressure, you would also have a higher preload. So that's letter P. Di ba? So ibig sabihin, kung mataas yung preload mo, ibig sabihin, there's more blood in your right atrium. Di ba? Next, cardiac output, central venous pressure of 6 or central venous pressure of 10. Sabi natin, if mataas ang central venous pressure natin, mataas din ang right atrial pressure, which means there's also more preload. And the higher preload leads to greater cardiac output. So answer here is letter B. Higher central venous pressure, more blood returning back to the heart. Therefore, you will have a greater cardiac output. O, ito na. Venous return at steady state, end systolic volume of 50 ml or end systolic volume of 70 ml. So, end systolic volume of 50 ml, ibig sabihin, konti lang yung blood mo in your ventricles. So, you have relatively low amount of blood in your heart, which means na mas madaling makakabalik yung blood papunta sa iyong heart. Diba? So, there would be more venous return. Another rationale. Kung mababa ang end systolic volume mo, ibig sabihin mataas yung stroke volume mo, di ba? Kasi kung konti lang natira, ibig sabihin marami yung nilabas mo. Which means you have a higher contractility. Kung mataas ang contractility mo ng heart, that would also mean your venous return would increase. Kasi more blood yung pinump mo, more blood din dapat yung babalik. And so answer here would be letter A. Okay? Two rationales. Yung una, since less blood yun nasa heart, mas madaling makakabalik yung blood galing sa veins. And secondly, since maliit yung end systolic volume mo, mataas yung stroke volume mo, mataas yung nilabas mo, mataas din yung kailangan bumalik sa heart. Okay? That's a higher venous return at end systolic volume of 50. Next, right atrial pressure with blood transfusion or venoconstriction. So this is letter C. Why? Kasi blood transfusion, tataas yung blood intravascular volume mo, then you will have a greater right atrial pressure. Kapag kinastrict mo yung veins mo, mas mapump nila yung blood pabalik na right atrium, you would also have a higher right atrial pressure. So both of them increase your right atrial pressure. Okay? So balikan lang natin tong table na to. I hope you now understand that inotropic agents which cause an increase in your cardiac contractility would increase the slope of your cardiac function curve, pero no change the vascular function, and your RAP at equilibrium will decrease. Kasi the more you're able to pump the blood, okay, the less blood will remain in the heart. Therefore, you will have a decrease in right atrial pressure. Kapag naman intravascular volume increase, wala ka namang binago sa heart, so walang magbabago sa cardiac function curve. You increase the volume, so increase the blood returning to the heart, so you increase your vascular function curve, shift to the right and up. And you also increase your right atrial pressure kasi more blood in the circulation, more blood going back to the heart, you will have an increased right atrial pressure. Kapag TPR increased, you decrease your cardiac function curve because of the afterload. You decrease vascular function because of decreased amount of blood going to the veins kasi sinikpan mo yung vessels mo. And your right atrial pressure will remain the same. Again, bakit? Kasi increase your cardiac output. You decrease your cardiac output, di ba? Would increase your right atrial pressure. But since konti lang din yung blood na bumabalik sa heart, you decrease your right atrial pressure. So, balance lang sila. Okay? So, now we move on to biochemistry. So, in biochemistry, we have digestion of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. So, for carbohydrates, di ba, we have an oral phase. We have a pancreatic phase and we have your intestinal phase. Sa oral phase, isa lang naman enzyme natin dyan. That's your alpha amylase. And that initially breaks down yung starch natin into dextrins, isomaltose, maltotriose, di ba? So these are the products there. So, ang ginagawa lang naman nun, kung may starch ka na mahabang glucose chain ng alpha-1,4, hinahati lang yan sa loob. Puro alpha-1,4, pinaghiwa-hiwalay lang ngayon. Pero syempre matitira pa rin yung mga maltotriose mo, di ba? Dextrins, which are fourth chains of glucose pa rin siya na alpha-1,4 and alpha-1,6, may branching. Pero mas maliit siya kaysa sa starch. Okay? Stomach, walang mangyayari. Wala naman tayong enzyme for carbohydrate digestion there. And then in the pancreatic phase, you will release another amylase, pero ang pangalan niya is pancreatic alpha amylase. And that will further digest yung mga dextrins mo, your maltotriose into maltose, which is 2 glucose molecules linked by alpha-1,4, isomaltose, which is 2 maltose linked by alpha-1,6, di ba? And then finally, we arrive at the intestinal brush border where we have our enzyme complexes. So we have 4 enzyme complexes, di ba? And maganda yung pagkaka-arrange nila kasi yung starting letters nila is SGLT. Diba, SGLT yung nag-absorb ng carbohydrate. O yan din yung initial letters ng complexes of your disaccharidases. Meaning, kunwari, diba, for example, maltase, diba, disaccharide yon and it will break down to 2 glucose molecules. Sucrase breaks it down into, sucrose into glucose and fructose. Diba? And lactase breaks down lactose into glucose and galactose. So ito yung apat na disaccharidase complexes natin. We have the first one, sucrase isomaltase complex. Ang subunits niya is the sucrase maltase and isomaltase maltase. So kung mapapansin nyo, both subunits, syempre sa pangalan pa lang may sucrase at isomaltase, pero meron din silang maltase enzyme. And so since parehas silang may maltase enzyme, this accounts for 80% of maltase digestion. And sabi natin, maltase will break down maltose into 2 glucose molecules. So we have a glucose here, and dahil sucrase natin will break down sucrose into glucose and fructose, so we also have fructose as a product. Kapag naman glucoamylase, so ang subunits niya, that's glucoamylase and maltase. Si glucoamylase, parehas lang siya sa ginagawa ng mga amylase natin. Alpha-1,4 din. Binibreak down lang niya yung alpha-1,4 between glucose molecules. Same thing with your maltase. And kung 80% ay sa sucrase isomaltase complex, si maltase ay si glucoamylase complex, which contains your maltase subunit, is 20% ng maltase digestion. And syempre, puro glucose lang naman to. So, glucose lang din yung products. With lactase, glucosylceramidase, so medyo complicated yung pangalan. Well, lactase, very simple, breaks down lactose into glucose and galactose. But glucosylceramidase, I hope you remember this from the lesson of Dr. Macarana sa lipid. This is a ceramide. So, sphingolipid yan na may connected na carbohydrate at the first OH group, first carbon. Diba? This is a glycolipid. So, diba yung structure ng ceramide, ito yung sphingosine, and then may fatty acid attached dito, tapos may carbohydrate attached here. So, yan yung kinikleave ng glucosylceramidase enzyme. So, tatanggalin niya to. So, you will result in a carbohydrate, a glucose, or a galactose as well. And then trehalase, which is quite unique here. We find this so ang binibreakdown niya is trehalose, which we find in mushrooms. Trehalose is glucose din naman siya, puro glucose units lang siya. Pero ang connection niya, instead of alpha-1,4, it's glucose in alpha-1,1. So yan lang yung unique sa kanya, alpha-1,1 connection yung dalawang glucose sa trehalose. So again, SGLT ha, SGLT, sucrase isomaltase complex, glucoamylase complex, lactase, glucosylceramidase, and trehalase. So for lipid metabolism, so we have two major pathways. Yung first, yung mas madali, which is the short chain fatty acid, di ba? And yung medium chain fatty acid, they only use yung ating lingual and gastric lipase. Yan lang kailangan nila. Fully digested na yan, magiging glycerol ka na. And 3 fatty acids. And then, hindi na niya kailangan gawin to lahat. Ma-absorb na yan directly into the portal circulation. So the bulk of our discussion would be about your long chain fatty acids kasi medyo complicated yung kailangan gawin natin. So the digestion of your long chain fatty acids starts actually in your duodenum na, in your pancreatic phase. Your short chain and medium chain fatty acids, from the names themselves, di ba, ang kailangan nilang enzyme is lingual lipase sa mouth, sa oral cavity, and gastric lipase, so sa stomach. Okay, but your long chain fatty acids are so big that they need to be emulsified first. And yung emulsification natin happens in your duodenum by the action of your bile salts. So the first step is emulsification by your bile salts. So ang gagawin niya, yung malaking blob of triacylglycerols, gagawin niyang mga small particles. So emulsify niya, parang yung malaking yun, i-breakdown lang niya into smaller particles. Why? Para mas madali silang ma-act upon by your enzyme, which is your lipase. So after emulsification, you now have hydrolysis. Hydrolysis by your lipase enzyme. So ang gagawin niya, yung triacylglycerol, kung ito yung glycerol, tas ito yung fatty acid, ang gagawin ni lipase, tatanggalin niya yung fatty acid at carbon 1 and carbon 3. Okay, ang may iwan is si 2-monoacylglycerol and dalawang free fatty acids. Okay? So, laging si lipase, ang ginagawa lang niya, carbon 1 and 3 line niya, tanggal niya. Nag-iiwan siya ng fatty acid sa glycerol. Kaya siya 2, kasi carbon 2 na monoacyl. Monoacyl, isang fatty acid chain na lang na naka-attach sa glycerol. Okay? And yung co-lipase, this has no catalytic activity, pero ang ginagawa lang niya is ini-enhance niya yung activity ni lipase. Okay? So yun na-breakdown na natin si triacylglycerol into 2 monoacylglycerol and si fatty acids. We now have to absorb them. And para ma-absorb natin, kailangan natin sila i-coat ulit or i-solubilize by bile salts ulit. So kanina, yung function ng bile salts natin is to emulsify yung malaking fat globule. Here, nag-form tayo ng micelles from yung broken down fatty acids into monoacylglycerols. Tapos pinalibutan natin sila ng mga bile salts ulit for solubilization and easier absorption. Okay? And next, after solubilization, so this is solubilization, so you form your micelles. After that is uptake. So uptake na natin sila into our enterocyte or your intestinal epithelial cell. And this is quite peculiar kasi after natin i-uptake, we now again resynthesize your triglyceride or your triacylglycerol. So ang weird, 'di ba? So meron tayong triacylglycerol, in-emulsify natin para ma-breakdown ng lipase into fatty acids and monoacylglycerol. Tapos nung in-uptake natin siya pabalik ng intestinal cell, ni-resynthesize natin ulit siya. So later on, I'll explain bakit natin ginawa yan. And then, nung niresynthesize natin si triacylglycerol, okay, we package it into what we call your chylomicrons. So your chylomicrons are complexes of proteins in the outside and your fats. So proteins in the outside, fats in the inside. Okay, so this is lipoprotein ang tawag sa kanya kasi lipo sa loob, fats, so nandyan sa loob yung mga triacylglycerol mo, yung cholesterol, and then yung protein mo sa labas. Ang protein component nito is your ApoB48. Okay? Okay, so yan. So nakapackage siya sa chylomicron and then it will now be transported into the circulation. Hindi sa portal circulation, via your lymphatic circulation. Okay? So pupunta siya sa lymph nodes as chyle, CHYLE. So yung fats natin mapupunta sa lymph nodes natin. It will go towards our thoracic duct and back into, so magde-drain yan sa veins, di ba? Magde-drain yung thoracic duct, for example, sa left brachiocephalic vein, di ba? So that will now lead to the return of our chylomicrons into the systemic circulation. Okay? So, why did we have to resynthesize itong triacylglycerols natin? When in the first place, dinegrade natin siya into 2 monoacylglycerol and free fatty acids. The reason is, yung triacylglyceride form, which is this one, glycerol na may attached na 3 free fatty acids, is the most nonpolar hydrophobic form of your fat. Ibig sabihin, it will be located in the core or in the center of your chylomicron. Kasi kung hindi natin yan ginawang triacylglycerol ulit, for example, iniwan natin siya as 2 monoacylglycerol and free fatty acids, these are not as nonpolar as your triacylglyceride. And kung hindi sila ganun ka-nonpolar, pwede yang magpunta sa periphery. And kung magpunta sa periphery ng chylomicron, yung mga free fatty acids mo, then there is a chance na ma-detach sila from the chylomicron and they will not be able to reach their destination. Okay? And yung destination nila is your adipose tissue, di ba? Your muscle. Okay? So, ang purpose, bakit natin ginawang triacylglycerol ulit is to have maximal hydrophobicity or nonpolarity para mapunta siya sa center, para matago siya dun, para hindi siya ma-detach. Okay? So, ito lang yung word summary ng sinabi ko. So, we now move on to protein digestion and absorption. And ang important lang naman dito is you know what happens in the different phases and kung ano yung enzyme na ginagamit and yung specificity. We start in the stomach. So, we use pepsin. Diba? So, pepsinogen siya, activated by the acidic conditions brought about by your hydrochloric acid, nagiging pepsin. Okay? And then you go to the pancreatic phase where you have these enzymes. So trypsinogen, which will be activated by enterokinase in the duodenum, di ba? So trypsinogen will become trypsin, and si trypsin can activate all the other enzymes. Okay, so si trypsin can activate chymotrypsinogen to chymotrypsin, proelastase to elastase, procarboxypeptidase to carboxypeptidase. So initially, si trypsinogen, ma-activate siya sa duodenum, maging trypsin. And then once na-activate si trypsin, it can now activate all the other enzymes. Okay? And then, ang matitira dyan is mga dipeptide, tripeptide, and then they will be absorbed into our intestinal cells. By the way, most of these enzymes are endopeptidases. Ibig sabihin, they cleave peptide bonds in the interior of the amino acid chain. So, ito yung amino acid chain, they cleave it here. Pero, in the intestinal brush border, we have what we call exopeptidases like your aminopeptidase and carboxypeptidase. Ang ginagawa nila is they cleave amino acids in the end. So, dito and dito. So, kung ito yung N-terminus mo, ito yung C-terminus mo, this one is your aminopeptidase. And this one is your carboxypeptidase. So, sa dulo sila nagtatanggal ng amino acid, kaya nga exopeptidase. Okay? So, ito yung summary. So, in the gastric phase, you have pepsin, and it cleaves. Sabi sa lecture, it's in the N-terminus. However, sa sources, sa mga libro, and sa mga nahanap ko in the journals, it's in the C-terminus din. Actually, dapat lahat sila C-terminus. I don't know. Pero, ito yung sabi ni Dr. N-terminus. So, ang specificity niya is aromatic amino acids. Aromatic, di ba yung may mga benzene rings? Phenylalanine, tyrosine, hydroxylated phenylalanine lang yung tyrosine, di ba? And your tryptophan, indole ring. Your branch chain amino acids, valine, isoleucine, and leucine, and your methionine. Okay, in the pancreatic phase, you have trypsin, chymotrypsin, and elastase. So, lahat na yan, C-terminus na yan lahat. So, for trypsin, basic amino acids, lysine, arginine, and histidine. Bakit may asterisk to? Kasi si trypsin, primarily, ang kinikleave niya is si lysine and arginine. So, minsan lang kay histidine. Okay? Chymotrypsin is for aromatic din, like si pepsin, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan. And si elastase, lahat ng hydrophobic. So, yan, lahat yan. Ano ba to? Lysine, alanine, valine, isoleucine, leucine, proline, phenylalanine, methionine, and tryptophan. Basta hydrophobic kay elastase. When it comes to your intestinal phase, so mga exopeptidases na ito, we have carboxypeptidase A and carboxypeptidase B. So both of them cut doon sa carboxy terminus ng amino acid. And si carboxypeptidase A cuts aromatic, so phenylalanine, tyrosine, tryptophan, and branch chain, valine, isoleucine, and leucine. Si B, carboxypeptidase B, madali lang tandaan, B for basic. So lysine, arginine, and histidine. Si aminopeptidase cuts amino acids in the N-terminus ng buong amino acid chain. Okay? Pero sa C-terminus pa rin ng amino acid mismo. And wala siyang specificity. Ay, baka nalito kayo doon. Wait, drawing natin. Si aminopeptidase, kunwari, ito yung amino acid chain. Ayan, amino acid chain. Ito yung N-terminus, ito yung C-terminus. Dito siya nag-cleave sa N-terminus kasi nga aminopeptidase. Pero, kung i-zoom in natin to, zoom in natin ito yung N-terminus, di ba? This is the N-terminus ng amino acid, individual amino acid. This is the C-terminus ng individual amino acid. Ang pagkat niya, here. Okay? Yes, nasa N-terminus siya ng buong peptide, pero C-terminus pa rin ng individual amino acid. Kasi hindi mo na pwede i-cut dito. Wala ka nang kakat dyan. Dito lang, oh. Di ba? Sa C-terminus ng individual amino acid. Okay? I hope that's clear. So, yun yung pag-digest, paano yung pag-absorb. So, meron din mga specific absorbers, pag-absorb ng mga amino acids natin. For neutral daw, with short or polar side chain, we have serine, alanine, and threonine. Polar to, di ba? Kasi may OH group si serine, threonine may OH group. And short, which is alanine, kasi isang methyl group lang naman si alanine, di ba? For aromatic and hydrophobic, si methionine, tyrosine, di ba? Phenylalanine, leucine, isoleucine, valine, and tryptophan. Yung mga aromatic and hydrophobic yung mga yan. So amino acid. Amino acid, which is our secondary amino acid natin or amino acid. Kasi di ba yung amino group niya, yung alpha amino group niya, naka-ring. Di ba? That's your proline and hydroxyproline. For basic, so yung classic natin, si histidine, arginine, and lysine. But you also have ornithine and cysteine, or cysteine. For acidic, syempre, si glutamic acid and si aspartic acid and si glutamic acid. Diba? And for beta amino acids importer, you have beta-alanine and taurine. Okay? So beta for beta-alanine. Okay? So here's just the summary in text form. And so now we move on to the fourth one, which is the Introduction to Metabolism by Dr. Blas, which has 19 items in the cluster exam. And nung kinompare ko yung batch 2027 and batch 2026 Samplexes, halos parehas lang. Hindi, parehas na parehas nga with just the exception of a few options na binago niya. So I think a strategy dito is check the important concepts na tinatanong sa Samplex. And yun lang yung i-focus natin. Kasi pare-parehas lang yung concepts na tinatanong. And pag ni-rationalize natin to, we are able to study the connected concepts as well. So, for example, so sa batch 2023, batch 2027, ang tinanong which corresponds to stage 3 of catabolism. Dito naman, which corresponds to stage 1 of catabolism sa batch 2026. So, same concept, hindi ba lang yung specific question? Diba? So, yun. So, rationalize pa ba natin to? Sige. An anabolic pathway as compared to a catabolic pathway is usually characterized by which of the following? So, anabolic, building up, catabolic, breaking down. When you break down in a catabolic reaction, you release energy. You decrease your free energy. Diba? Exergonic. Pag anabolic, baliktad. You supply energy, it's endergonic. Diba? So, an anabolic pathway has a property of being energy requiring. Diba? Because a decrease in free energy and a free energy change of less than 0, this is catabolic. And for letter C, sabi, requires coupling with endergonic reaction. Hindi lalong naging hindi spontaneous. Diba? In order for it to be spontaneous, you need to couple it with an exergonic reaction. So mag-release ka ng energy sa exergonic reaction, which would supply the energy of your anabolic pathway. Okay? Which of the following is true of an amphibolic pathway? Amphi, narinig natin to, amphipathic, di ba? Amphiphilic, amphi meaning both characteristics. So you have both characteristics of anabolic and catabolic reactions. Okay? Letter B always utilizes energy for degradative reactions. No, this is for anabolic reactions. For building reactions, di ba? So hindi siya amphibolic. Replenishes depleted metabolites. This is an anaplerotic reaction. And involved in converting chemical energy to heat, this is catabolic. Diba? Next, which corresponds to stage 3 of catabolism and stage 1 of catabolism. Stage 1 kasi guys, so yung mga kinakain nating proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, we break them down into their smallest constituents. And then stage 2, we transform them to acetyl-CoA. Okay? And that will now allow them to enter the Krebs cycle for their oxidation. So pag na-oxidize sila, we have now enough electron carriers for the electron transport chain. We now form your energy. Okay? So stage 1 is the conversion of dietary into component building blocks. And stage 3 is the final oxidation of fat, sugars, and amino acids into energy, carbon dioxide, and water. Conversion into common metabolite, this is stage 2. Okay? A type of metabolic pathway undergoing repeated cycles with the initial substrate being regenerated is a circular pathway. Krebs cycle, urea cycle. Na-regenerate natin yung oxaloacetate, di ba? At the beginning, we used oxaloacetate at the beginning and then we ended with regenerating oxaloacetate at the end of the Krebs cycle. All of the following are true about the committed step of a metabolic pathway except, so a committed step, ibig sabihin, pag committed ka na sa pathway na yun, hindi na pwedeng yung substrate na yun papuntang ibang direction or papuntang ibang product. Diba? Pag committed siya, kapag nagtapos na yung reaction na yun, it will now go straight down into that pathway. So it is always irreversible, that's true. Kaya siya committed kasi irreversible siya. It ensures formation of the final product, yes. It is a rate, maybe a rate controlling step, pwede. It's not exclusively found in the catabolic pathway, okay? So, pwede rin siya sa anabolic pathway. So, sige, differentiate natin ang committed and rate limiting step. So, ganito lang yan. This is R for rate limiting. This is C for catabolic. Committed step. Okay? Committed step. All committed steps are rate limiting, but not all rate limiting steps are committed. Okay? So, tingnan nyo na ito, figure na to. All committed steps are rate limiting steps, but not all rate limiting steps are committed steps. Okay? Kapag rate limiting kasi, ibig sabihin siya yung pinakamabagal, ibig sabihin, sobrang taas ng activation energy na kailangan niya for the reaction to proceed. Kapag committed step, irreversible siya because of the large decrease in free energy. Parang ganyan. Itong free energy, large decrease in free energy, committed step. So, irreversible yan. Okay? Sobrang baba na ng energy mo dito. You cannot go back to this original energy state. Diba? So, always irreversible ang committed step. Next. The graph below shows the effect of energy change in metabolism, which of the following is a correct statement. So, logic guys. Kung mataas na yung energy ng cell mo, kung mataas na yung number of ATP mo, kailangan ba gumawa ka pa ng ATP or energy? Hindi na. Anong gusto mong gawin doon sa energy mo? Gamitin mo. Diba? So, the higher your energy charge, what will happen to your ATP generating pathway? It will decrease. Kasi hindi mo na kailangan mag-generate ng ATP, mataas na nga yung energy mo eh. Pero, kapag mataas ang energy mo, you want to use that energy for ATP utilizing pathways. Okay? So, yun yung graph na to. Itong paakyat. ATP utilizing and ATP generating program. Okay? So, which of the following is a correct statement? A decreases as energy charge increases. That's true. Diba? Kasi, na nga sa graph, nag-increase yung energy charge, bumababa si graph A, which is ATP generating. How about B? B represents energy generating reaction. Mali, that's your ATP utilizing reactions. Okay? Point C corresponds to the energy charge when the rate of anabolic reactions exceeds the rate of catabolic fraction. Point C, hindi. That's the point kung saan equilibrium, nag-equal ang ATP generating and ATP utilizing mo. So walang exceed doon. And point D represents the normal energy charge when the catabolic rate equals anabolic rate. As we said, that's not point D, but that's point C. Okay? Dito sa batch 2026, binago lang yung options. So which of the following is a correct statement? Point B decreases as energy change increases. Mali. Because it's increasing. This is your ATP utilizing pathway. Point A represents energy generating reaction. Bumababa siya as energy charge increases. Yes. This is true. Okay? And C and D have the same rationale lang as 2027. So the graph of S versus velocity is shown for the following enzymes, which of the following is true of the graph with the middle curve as control. So this is just your same with yung lesson ni Doc Ligo about enzymes. So, which of the following is true? Di ba pag meron kang allosteric, hindi na gumagana si Michaelis-Menten kinetics kasi you have here cooperativity. Di ba? So, kay Michaelis-Menten, it's a rectangular hyperbola. Kapag may allosteric ka, it's a sigmoidal. Di ba? So, mali itong A. A shows negative cooperativity. Hindi. This is positive cooperativity. Because the more, kunwari, hemoglobin. Kapag kumabit na yung oxygen doon, hindi mas madali na kumabit yung ibang oxygen. Kaya nagiging steep yung curve. Diba? So, mali ito. This is positive cooperativity. How about letter C? B shows decreased affinity of the enzyme for the substrate. Ito ba yung letter? Ano ba yung B? Ito. So, nag-increase yung Km niya. Tama. Shift natin to the right, nag-increase yung Km. Ibig sabihin, to achieve 1/2 of our Vmax or maximum velocity, you need a higher substrate concentration kasi mababa yung affinity mo. So this is true. And the allosteric enzyme is of the V-type. Mali. This is the K-type. Kasi ang ginalaw natin is the Km, not the Vmax. Diba? Dito naman sa 2026, ang binago lang is A shows positive cooperativity, which is true. This is indeed positive cooperativity. Tapos itong letter C, B shows increased affinity daw. This is false. This is decreased affinity. Diba? You increase the Km, you decrease the affinity. Metabolic pathways can be regulated by the induction of enzyme catalyzing either rate-limiting or committed steps in contrast to regulation of housekeeping enzymes. This type of regulation is characterized as being so. Tingnan nyo to Tingnan nyo itong options A, C, and D. A and C muna. Course control and faster rate are the same thing. Alam mo yung pag sa microscope, di ba yung course adjustment knob? Parang pang mabilis ang adjustment ng ng focus, di ba? Pero pag sinabi mong fine, slow din ibig sabihin yan. Di ba yung fine adjustment na mabagal mong ginagalaw yun para sa high power objective, di ba? Para maayos yung focus mo sa high power objective. Di ba? So kapag mayroong two options na parehas, probably mali na yan. Hindi yan yung sagot. And yung pag-regulate natin ng enzymes, yung housekeeping enzymes, sila kasi yan. Sila yung course control, faster rate, and sila din yung allosterically activated or inhibited. Bakit naging course and fast yung pag-allosterically activate or inhibit mo? Kasi kung ito yung enzyme mo, lagyan mo lang ng allosteric inhibitor dito, tapos na regulate mo na kagad yung activity ng enzyme. Pero yung induction of enzyme activity, yung pag-induce ng enzyme activity, meaning you produce more enzymes, you do that at the genetic level. And marami ka pang kailangan gawin dyan, transcription, translation, and it's a fine and slow process. So marami pang signals na kailangan gawin dun in order to have changes at the genetic level for you to induce the production of your enzymes. Okay, so the answer here is letter B. The regulation of enzyme synthesis at the genetic level, which is fine and slow, okay? And that will cause the induction or repression of your enzyme activity. And last, match the type of metabolic regulation with the description given. So, binding of an inhibitor molecule to the non-active site, that's allosteric control, di ba? So, non-active site. Phosphorylation of the enzyme is a covalent modification. Reversible, irreversible. Pag phosphorylation, that's reversible. Bakit? Kasi pwede mo namang i-dephosphorylate. Di ba? Next, metabolic pathway found in two separate organelles, syempre, compartmentation. Naka-compartmentalize yung metabolic pathways mo, naka-compartmentalize yung enzymes. Two isoenzymes regulated differently such that one of the products cannot inhibit the entire biosynthetic pathway. Well, same lang naman yung kinakatalyze nilang reaction, pero iba lang yung regulation nila, and you call that your isoenzymes, and that is your enzyme multiplicity. You have multiple forms of the same enzyme. Okay? And I also put here yung batch 2025. So, similar concepts. Iba lang yung way ng pagtanong. So, practice nyo na lang to. Here as well. Ayan, tingnan nyo. Lumabas ulit yung stage 2 of catabolism. Kanina stage 3, ta stage 1. Ito naman stage 2, tinanong. Ito rin, umulit di ba? Spiral type and circular type. Di ba? Umulit ulit. Same concept, iba lang yung way ng pagtanong. Or yung specific na tinatanong within a concept. Okay, I think that's it for our not so short review of embryology, physiology, and biochemistry. So I hope you were able to get a bird's eye view and you were able to reinforce some of the most important concepts in those three subjects. So I wish the best of luck sa atin next week. Galingan and pagpalain. Bye-bye.